I had the good fortune to receive a letter here recently that I would like to share excerpts of that letter with you. The letter is from a British Lieutenant General R.C. Menzies. And the letter is addressed to Leonard and Rowena Lind, who reside here in Medina. And I would like to read 2 paragraphs to you, if you would allow me. And the general writes, "Dear Mr. and Mrs. Lind, I am writing to you in my capacity as chairman of the Upper Hayford Parish Council, Upper Hayford being a village in England. As you will be only too well aware, the 17th September this year will be the 20th anniversary of the F-111 crash, which claimed the lives of your son Jerry and his colleague, Major David Mike McGuire. We in Upper Hayford have never forgotten the bravery and selflessness of Jerry and Mike, who chose to remain with the stricken aircraft until the very last moment to prevent the possibility of its crashing onto the village with potentially a large loss of life on the ground. Sadly, they both paid the ultimate price for this heroic decision. We have therefore decided to mark their sacrifice by holding an act of commemoration on Sunday, 16 September 2012, in the Upper Hayford Cemetery, where a memorial stone to Jerry and Mike was placed shortly after the crash. This act will be supported by members of the United States Air Force based nearby at RAF Proughton, who will provide an honor guard. We also expect the presence of the newly appointed air attaché from the United States Embassy in London, Brigadier General Select John T. Quintas. General Quintas was actually serving in Upper Hayford at the time of the crash and knew both your son and Major McGuire. We also will be inviting guests from the local civic community, and we expect a good turnout of villagers. And that is signed by Bob Menzies. As you are well aware, heroic deeds are not reserved solely to acts that occurred during combat. You'll certainly recall what occurred on 9/11 at Ground Zero in New York City and the crash at Shanksville, Pennsylvania. And those were certainly heroic actions that people had taken. Well, this was a heroic action where the pilot of this F-111, Jerry Lind, chose to remain with the aircraft to guide it away from the village, and ultimately he and his weapons system operator expired as a result of the crash. For some time, we have had among us 2 notable people, but it may not have been brought to your attention, and that is the purpose of my reading this letter to you this evening. So folks, what I would like to do, I would like to ask Mr. Leonard Lind and his wife Rowena to please stand for recognition. The mother and father of Jerry Lind, Captain Jerry Lind, graduated from Hudson High School, just about an hour west of here, or I should say east of here. At age 16, wasn't old enough to apply to the Air Force Academy, So he enrolled at Purdue, spent a year at Purdue. When he became 17, he applied for the Air Force Academy, where he graduated up near the top of his class and went on to flying school, and then unfortunately had the accident at Upper Hayford that cost him his life. But he decided to save the village at his own expense. Thank you, Leonard and Rowena.
It's a real pleasure to be here, but just before I do, a word about your July speaker, Charlie Aldridge. He is now 93, and he spoke of his experiences as, and some of you learned later, was a carpenter in the headquarters company of the 116th Regiment of the 29th Omaha Beach D-Day Division. Those little bags were for the personal effects of those who died, and his job in headquarters company had to do with our dead. And he did that all the way from the coast to the Elba River. But he left out what I thought was perhaps the most fascinating part of his talk. While he was training, and they were alternating 35-mile marches with relaxing 25-mile marches in the training period, he met and wooed a member of the Auxiliary Territorial Service, which was the British Women's Corps. That service took something like almost 1,000 got killed serving in England, but in dangerous places like airfields and places like that. Pat joined as soon as she was 18, still in 1940, and went on to become one of 8 company sergeant majors in the ATS. At that point, she outranked then Princess, now Queen Elizabeth, and before Mary Churchill decided she wanted to commission, she outranked Mary Churchill as well. But Charlie married her when he was home on leave early in '45, and he had enough points to get out, but he stuck around hoping to get discharged in England. Well, that didn't happen, so Pat came over on the Queen Mary. If you recall him telling us about this, the experience while he was aboard when it sliced a cruiser in half, a British cruiser in half, and it's a ship he came back on. But she made her way alone to New York and then made her way down to Virginia, where he was discharged and now working. But I always thought that was the neat part of his story. Tonight, for my story, feel free to interrupt with a question at any time. I'd just as soon be understood as to follow right strictly along. My story begins in October of 1940. If you recall, the war in Europe was over a year old at that point. The rape of Nanking in China had occurred 3 years sooner, or 3 years before that. We were on our way back from 5 months home leave in the United States, and we stopped in Tokyo on the President Coolidge and took rickshaws to a fancy Japanese restaurant, most of whose customers appeared to be high-ranking Japanese officers in full dress uniform. Our parents warned us not to stare, and they fed us off in a little private dining room, so there was no conflict. But after a wonderful dinner on a low round table with a walk in the middle that a young lady in a kimono made for us, I peeked at the officers as we went out, never thinking that shortly we would be prisoners of the Japanese not too long down the road. And today I wonder whether any of those were involved in the decision that the Japanese took on the 1st of November 1940 to go to war with the United States in the last week of November 1941 in the event that the U.S. would not permit Japan to take over the Pacific. But we were going back to the Philippines because in 1928 Goodyear decided that they were going into the rubber business to supply their factories. And Dad, who had been born in an immigrant family on a little farm in Talmadge, was selected at the age of 28 to be one of their first crude rubber people. He had met and was wooing our mother, and once he got selected, he said, you know, publish the bands, we got to get married and go. And so at 22, she got the bands published, and they married just in time to head out for Sumatra. The month-long trip across the ocean was their honeymoon, which was kind of a neat honeymoon. But on the way through Malaysia, they had a delightful hour and a half with Will Rogers at a hotel there, and they went on then to eastern Sumatra, where with the under the direction of Dutch rubber planters, they created the Wingfoot plantation out of 31¼ square miles of primeval jungle, in the process learning the rubber growing business. The plantations got closed because the price of rubber plummeted with a depression. It cost more to raise the rubber than they could sell it for. So they came back to the States. They wanted Dad for another assignment, so they kept him on the payroll working in Goodyear service stores and anything else just to keep him on the payroll. But then in '35, just after I was born, he was given the plantation in the southern Philippines at the little town of Cabasalan. That's 13 miles upriver, and there are no roads into that part of the world. I'd also, while we have this slide up, Zamboanga down at the tip here, and Davao over on the right-hand side will appear later in the story. So just to give you a feel for where things are, we'll go with that. The plantation was small. It was only about 3¾ square miles. So by rubber plantation size, that's small. But it was established for the sole purpose of creating rubber seedlings. And of course, to do that, you have to have mature trees, because rubber is bud grafted like roses. So you take cuttings from the mature, high-yielding trees, and you put it onto hardy rootstock, just like a rose. And that was to be then shipped to Central America for the Goodyear plantations being developed there. It was so critical that when World War II, when 1941 came along, it was believed that rubber would be the pacing item of the war. And the estimates were that World War II would last 10 years before enough rubber was raised to be able to conduct a winning campaign in both Europe and Japan. It was so critical that the government was shipping out rubber seedlings to Central America on B-18s that were being recycled back out of the Philippines. The last B-18 aircraft with rubber seedlings on it left just 10 days before Pearl Harbor. The excuse me. The company said maybe women and children should go home in 1941, and the assistant manager, who had a young wife and a little girl, sent his wife and children, her wife and little girl, home. But Mom said she'd married him for better or for worse, and she had faith that he could get us out if the flag went up. And we had a variety of escape routes. We have a 40-foot company launch, and the idea was to put rubber bales on the side and on the roof, and rubber bales will stop 50 caliber bullets. So it was basically armor plating the company launch and taking seedlings and rubber to Australia, a route of some 1,800 miles of open ocean. The second plan, we developed a hideout up in the jungle, and we went and we lived there for 3 weeks just to prove that we had everything there. Even had running water, and we were by a stream. Every morning we'd get up and there's the animals down there at the river getting a drink. But the third plan, the Navy was supposed to pick us up at the mouth of the Cabasalan River. All we had to do was get down the 13 miles to the ocean, and the Navy was going to pick us up. Well, for lots of reasons, all the plans failed. The one in the jungle, because the U.S. Army came along and requisitioned all our medicines, including all our quinine. And these are malarial jungles, so you don't want to be without quinine. So on the 30th of June, after the fall of Corregidor, a Japanese lieutenant and a squad came in by boat and came up to the plantation, and on the 3rd of July took us as prisoners to Zamboanga. In these pre-war pictures, or pre-capture pictures, my parents, my mother and father, on one of the 4 porches of our house. This porch, as we'll see the other end, and in the middle there was a big table. We ate our breakfast out there, so it was a substantial porch. On the other end was us kids. That picture is reversed, but I'm the one with the big ears on the left. This is a visiting girl, and my sister and my brother on the other end of the porch. We live fairly comfortably in a 13,000 square foot house. Our living room is big enough. It had 3 sets of living room furniture, and us kids could ride bicycles around the living room. This is Dad with his newly purchased camera in front of that porch that we were looking at in front of the house. Mom, on the other hand, had the job of being a manager. She had to hire, train, and manage the staff, which consisted of 11, several of whom are shown here with us kids. This included a nursemaid or ama for each one of the children. But we went from that kind of reasonably comfortable life to crowded, fairly dirty and cramped prison camps. It was quite a change. But on the 3rd of July, we went into Zamboanga, remember down at the end, about 80 miles away, and we were put into a house on stilts, and at that point there was something like 26 of us crammed into this little house. We slept on the floors and what have you. Had a roll of barbed wire, and there was a Japanese guard stationed in front of the house. But at that point I was 8, and I discovered I could lift the wire on the back corner out of sight of the guard, and there were destroyed buildings behind me, so I went looking for treasures. And I found a new cigar box and shells and all sorts of neat things, and we had no toys, so it was something to do. And then I'd sneak back in, and didn't be able to do that long, and then we had to leave the cigar box behind, to my bitter regret. But they put us on a minesweeper for 2 days, and we went around to Davao, on the other side of the island, on the east side of Mindanao. In Davao, we met 10 of the Bataan nurses. If you've read The Wee Band of Angels, their story of the 10 of those who escaped and got to Mindanao, but then got stranded in Mindanao. We thought they were most unusually dressed because they wore slacks. They wore men's army slacks, and of course at that point in time women just didn't do that. I thought they were rather striking in their slacks, but shortly they were shipped out. We and they thought that they were being repatriated back to the States. Actually, they went to the Santa Tomas internment camp in Manila, which was a civilian camp. And it was probably one time in the war when military and civilians were in a single camp for an extended period of time. Shortly we were trucked 4 kilometers south to a roadhouse out in the country, and it had the rather ironic name Happy Life Blues. And it must have been popular because there were more broken beer bottles around that place than you could shake a stick at. But after roll call, we were directed up the steps and we found the new family living quarters. The family had 5 4-by-7-foot plots chalk marked out on the dance floor, about 1/3 of the way in from the right wall and about 2/3 of the way up from the door we came in. Kind of noisy when people go by with wooden slippers in the middle of the night, and you're sitting there inches away from the corridors through these piles of bed with everybody sleeping one beside the other. Dad very quickly got permission to have a little plot of land next to the dance hall, and we picked up kilos and kilos of broken glass from that area. And then Dad, who was 42, and I went out into the jungle under Japanese guards to collect materials. And we made trip after trip after trip, bringing back bamboo, coconut fronds. There was a swamp wood that made good flooring. Abaca, which is a hemp source material, looks like a banana tree. We would cut the leaves off and we would carry those in to create the ropes that we would use to tie the thing together. Finally, after some time, and with the help of the Jesuits who had the next plot and were building their little chapel there, we had a house raising, and Dad, using the one nail that he'd found and straightened in the ridgepole, you can see it, there it is, built the house. Mom and myself, with the help of my sister, wove coconut fronds for the siding. And the house on the top, on the upper level, had a bed for my parents, a divider, and then a bed for the 3 of us children. Down on the lower level, Dad built a picnic table and bench, which was where we ate. The kitchen area, Mom had a 2-burner stove, a pile of dirt, and 2 fireplaces, so she could actually have 2 burners going at the same time. Now, of course, fire and that kind of materials are inimical, so this whole section was designed so it could be pushed away in case it caught fire. On this side and the other side, Mom had her counter space for cooking. Dad immediately started to build the Huber factory underneath here. Next slide. Making the materials. This is a coconut grater and a coconut press out of scraps, tin cans, leaf spring from an automobile, and what have you. And we would either bring in or buy coconuts, and we made Huber coconut oil, the best, finest, clearest oil available to sell. And when you got finished, you had little grape nut-like particles, and we kids loved that for the fat that it had. Made a wonderful snack. When Mom could get potatoes, she'd slice them thin and make French fries to sell. We'd put them on banana leaves and sell potato chips in the camp. When we could get cassava root, Dad would peel off the poisonous outer skin, and we made tapioca. When we could get peanuts, we made peanut butter for extra protein. But it gave us a home, an industry, and we were living reasonably comfortably. I had my own little business making siding. I brought in coconut fronds, and I wove coconut fronds for siding for other people. I can remember at least 2 of the families that I made the siding for their smaller huts. They were not the elaborate bi-level places that my dad had built. But this went on until 4th of July, 43, when the Camp Commandant shut down the building program and put me out of business in the process. But this was because 30 miles north of Davao, at the American POW camp, at the Davao Penal Colony, Lieutenant Dice had led a team of 9 other Americans and 2 Filipinos in an escape from that camp. They went through the swamp, and once they got out of the swamp, the guerrillas held off the Japanese soldiers, and they eventually got back to Australia and back to this country. It was their story that let the people in America know of the Bataan Death March and of the atrocities that were done to those who had surrendered. Of those who surrendered, 1 in 3 did not survive internment compared to the normal 3 or 4% elsewhere. In the U.S. really, we've been there about 9 months, about that time, in the camp. The U.S. government really didn't want the story to get out, but the papers had got sniffing on it. So finally it was released at the beginning of the war bond drive early in 1944. They finally released the Dice story and the story of the escape and the story of the terrible things going on in camp. One thing that we did have is the fact that when we first got there, of course, there were no bathrooms. And so our early toilets were a pair of boards across the slit trench with a little low screen around it. Being ambitious and hardworking, the men got together, and pretty soon we had 6-holers. We were, basically using every penny we could get for food, so luxuries like toilet paper were non-existent. We used the husks of fresh coconuts, which aren't bad. The soft bottom set used pages out of books, even pages out of prayers and Bibles as we got down towards the end. But at least we were living fairly civilized, and we'd move the... Now, of course, there was a smell that you just really don't want to put up with, but you got used to it eventually. For the first 8 months, the Japanese made us feed ourselves with our own money. They weren't providing anything except a guard and the facility. And that dance hall had been machine gunned, so it had holes in the roof when we first got there, and until we could get the holes patched. But that only dripped when it rained. But finally, after 8 months, they allowed us 25 centavos per day per person. That's 12.5 cents American, 1942 money. We had calculated it took 37.5 cents a day for a survival budget, essentially all for food. There was no money for anything else. But that meant we could occasionally get the head of a carabao as meat for the 300 and some of us in the camp. I can remember going into the kitchen, and there was this magnificent carabao head on the table, absolutely covered in big black flies from the garbage pit. And let's just say, my wife will confirm, I hate flies. But at least it meant that we got a sliver of meat in our stew of boiled okra and boiled eggplant, the affordable vegetables. The life was reasonably good. We were separate, we had a family, we doing all sorts of things, but apparently the Japanese got concerned. North and west of us, the Philippine-American guerrillas were operating, and there were at that point something like 30,000 Philippine-American guerrillas. In the whole of the Philippines, there were over 250,000 Philippine-American guerrillas. The Japanese had put as many as 60,000 troops in to defeat the guerrillas on Mindanao alone, and were not able to do it. The guerrillas essentially restricted them to the cities on the coast. They decided that maybe it was time to move the prisoners someplace else, and even though Davao was basically a Japanese city. A huge Japanese number of Japanese people had settled there before the war, and it was as one of their stronger bases. They also decided to move some of the Japanese civilians. So on the 23rd of December, 1943, we were told at morning roll call that we would be leaving the next day for Manila. So on Christmas Eve, 1943, we were taken by barge out to a small Japanese freighter, the Shansei Maru number 1, and we were put down in the aft hold, all 305 of us, while Japanese civilians were on the forward part of the ship. In the bottom, there were rows of rough planking to make a place for people to lie down. This was a lot better than the hell ships where there wasn't room even to soldiers to lie down on the bare deck. But the rows and spaces were such that there was just room for all 305 of us to lie down if we lay, side by side and end to end and what have you. Christmas Eve, we sang Christmas carols, and then we joined 2 lady missionaries who had been kicked out of Japan in one upper section with the 5 of us family and lay down to sleep on Christmas Eve. It was rat infested, and one of them ran across my sister's leg in the middle of the night, and she screamed, and I said, he's probably more afraid of you than you are of him, so go back to sleep. Christmas morning, we discovered Santa Claus had come. My parents had made a single handmade toy for each of us, and we celebrated with more carols and the opening of our gifts, if you will, on Christmas morning down there in the hold. Can I have the next slide, please? We started in Davao on the bottom right, and I think I have used the, there it is. Going around, we followed very close to the coast all the way up, not really being aware of how vulnerable we were. Locked down in the aft hold, American submarines could have done to us what they did to so many of the hell ships, and we'd have drowned if they had been hit by a torpedo. I just recently found out that there were radio stations on Mindanao by guerrilla American radio stations, and I now firmly believe that there was a message to the U.S. Navy said, Shenzhou Maru number 1 is carrying Americans, take it off your hit list. That was not available to those from the hell ships where the ships leaving were not under observation by the guerrillas who were up in the hills well away from that place. But in any event, on the 2nd of January, we sailed past Corregidor into Manila Bay and docked at the main dock, and were trucked to the Santa Tomas internment camp. This is the modern building, the 1932 building, of this 400-year-old university. This is a modern picture, but it looks just like it did when we were there. Santa Tomas was heaven on earth for us hicks from Davao. They had toilet paper, 1 square per trip. They had real and not homemade soap. They had shops where you could buy things. There was a package exchange to the outside. They had schools up there, those rooms up on the top. My classroom was about halfway back on the right. The whole thing was just incredibly so much better than the happy life blues that we thought we'd died and gone to heaven. Unfortunately, we were back to sleeping on the floor. In this case, the concrete floor of the classrooms. Women were on the 2nd floor, And my brother and I and Dad were up on the third floor on the back. Mom was on the right-hand side with her room and my sister. But Dad could get money, and I had turned over all of the 3 pesos and 65 centavos. I had turned over all but 35 centavos to my parents as part of, you work together as a family. The rest of it, I bought 3 native cigarettes for them. They were heavy smokers at the time. After dinner each day, they would light one of them. Each would take 2 puffs and put it out. And then when they get done, they would take the balance, put in some other leaves, and make new cigarettes. But their health was probably improved by the fact that they weren't able to get tobacco. But Dad repaid the 3 pesos and 30 centavos, and so for a while, my brother and sister and I could go to a shop and each get a small piece of hard candy, an unimaginable luxury at that point. Dad rather quickly arranged to buy and fix up a shack. It's the best picture I've got, but that's a 1945 picture, and it's been sitting in a scrapbook for a long time. But that was our house, and it's a lot better than the sleeping on the concrete floor. Dad built a loft for the 3 kids up and there was room for a bed and a table and a little tiny cooking area, and that was it. It was located cat-a-cornered across from the education building. Now let's use this one for the moment. That's where the shack was. This is the education building. And this was the main road. The hospital was down here. The main building that you saw was up here. The front gate was here. And the camp then extended basically a large city block, and with a large fence around it. And that was the camp for something like, at one point, over 4,000 of us. Most of them sleeping on the floors in classrooms. We were one of the lucky ones because we were sleeping in our own shack and living in our own shack. Us kids, other kids quickly told us kids about 3 teenage boys who had escaped early in the setting up of the camp. And this was set up immediately after the Japanese took over. And they had been badly beaten. They were shot in front of witnesses from the camp and then buried. One of them was still alive when they were shoveling dirt in on top of him. Dad was photographed with 4 others, and the word was any one of each group of 5 escaped. The rest of the group of 5 would be killed, would be shot. We attended classes on the top floor and a variety of other cultural activities. It was, as I say, it was fairly pleasant. But on the 9th of January, just after we arrived, the Japanese Army decided that we were no longer civilian internees, but were POWs. So for the last year or so, we were, according to the Japanese, official prisoners of war, just like the military. And that meant that the Bataan nurses who were there on campus with us and we were, in their eyes, one and the same, both military. The good times quickly ended, however. By June of 1944, the starving times began, and the food rations get being cut and cut and cut again, reaching the point at the end where we were down to 600 calories a day and losing people on a regular basis by starvation. My folks immediately had gone into the mode of preparing for the worst. We each got a Red Cross package when we got to Santa Tomas, and we had received 2 packages that our family had sent us, out of the many that they sent, and the Red Cross sent one package per month per prisoner. Like the military prisoners, most of the packages didn't get past the Japanese. So we were stuck with that 5 packages and any other non-perishables that we could get. Mom took a job in the kitchen because those peeling potatoes got to take home the inedible skins and scrape out a little bit more potato to help feed their families. So she would bring home a pail of potato peelings and try and get maybe a fraction of a cup of additional peelings to enhance our food supply. We also planted sweet potatoes. Not that they'd ever get sweet potatoes, but we were eating the greens, boiling and eating the greens of the sweet potatoes to give us a vegetable, if you will, because basically the food was rice gruel called lugao with a few beans and a few kernels of corn in it. It was basically, and a little flour made into gravy without fat, was basically the food that we were living on at that point. More dangerously, Dad contacted the smugglers. There's always smugglers. They smuggled food in the false bottoms of the garbage cans that took out the garbage until we reached the point there was no more garbage. And then there were no more cans going out and no more smuggling going on. But it was clear to everybody that if the smugglers and those who used them ever were identified, that both of them would be dead. And near the end, I can remember the people that I thought were smugglers were arrested. And I walked by the main building and I saw one of them in the room in which they were locked. And I said a prayer for them and for us and wondered whether we would be dead before I reached my 11th birthday if they talked. They didn't talk. They were found tortured and beheaded along with 3 American nuns and 3 Philippine men. Their bodies were discovered shortly after the city was liberated. But I best remember 2 ducks that got smuggled in while the garbage cans were still in operation. We paid in today's dollars $9,000 for those 2 ducks that probably didn't weigh a pound apiece. It gave us a little extra protein, a little fat, but I got the job of getting rid of the feathers. And so one night, just when it was getting dark, I went over and I tried to shove those feathers down in under the garbage. Well, it's like herding mosquitoes. You can't get feathers to go down in that kind of a situation, and people were saying, "What's that? What's going on? What's going on?" Well, fortunately, they didn't betray us, and we got the advantage of those $9,000 ducks to help us along in the course of things. But we were slowly starving to death. I can remember Christmas of 1944. We joined with 4 other people, so the 9 of us got all our little scraps together, and Mom and one of the other ladies made a fruitcake. My wife will tell you I love fruitcake, but it was the size of a cupcake, and we divided it exactly equal among the 9 of us as our Christmas feast that day for Christmas. But the hunger was kind of constant. We would sit around in the evenings, no lights and, no television, no nothing. We'd talk, Mom put us through the multiplication tables and division and English lessons and what have you. But occasionally we'd talk about what we wanted. My dad, who was coming down with beriberi, wanted a glass of vinegar. My mother wanted a cold boiled white potato to eat in little nibbles. I wanted just a little bowl of plain white rice. But we ate everything in little tiny bites. And when we were done, we picked the plates up and licked them until there wasn't a speck of moisture or food on anything. Mom took bottoms of cans and put a spoonful of lugao for each of us children, and we ate that just before we went to bed so that we'd have something on our stomachs to make it easier to go to bed. Now, there have been some big events. September 21st was the first air raid. And man, you talk about joy in the camp. That was it. We could see the Americans were really coming. There they were, up there. That was a danger because then the Japanese were firing anti-aircraft. One came between my sister and I as we sat on our bunk up in the loft. One hit the chair of my mother just after she'd stood up. But somehow, based on the recommendations from the Japanese camp commandant, my dad built an air raid shelter under their bed in the shack, cutting chunks of sod and carrying them in and building up an air raid shelter. I was really upset that for the first time I couldn't help. I could not lift one of those chunks of sod. But it proved its worth, even though 2 pieces of shrapnel did come in. We were sitting so we would be safe, but one came close to my sister's arm and one came close to mine. I looked at the one hit past my sister, and I'm going to pick that up. I discovered fresh shrapnel is exceedingly hot. I dropped it like a hot potato. But we knew about Leyte on the 20th of October. The next day, in the announcements that were made over the public address system, the announcer went on and on about this shipment of so many kilos, 500 kilos of something from the Japanese was being delayed, and we could understand that, etc. But better late than never. And everybody in the camp knew exactly what he was saying. What we didn't know is that from the 23rd to the 26th of October, the world's greatest naval battle was going on, the Battle of Leyte Gulf. The Japanese were being stopped most places, but they succeeded at San Bernardino Straits and were coming down to destroy the Leyte landing site. All that stood in their way was Taffy 3, a group of 6 merchant vessels with a flight deck on them to carry a handful of planes, had 4 destroyers and 3 destroyer escorts. And they fought Admiral Kurita in the Yamato with more than a dozen battleships and cruisers and a whole flotilla of destroyers. He fought them for 90 minutes and was about to get totally wiped out when, unbelievably, Kurita, even though he was supposed to be a suicide mission, quit and turned around. If he had not, we would have delayed our rescue so long that we wouldn't be here. Dad estimated we were within 2 weeks of death by starvation at the very end. But fortunately, as I say, we didn't know that. The air raids continued on a regular basis, and the starvation continued. There was a emaciated horse and a little cart that brought bodies wrapped in sawali, a native cloth made from bamboo, from the hospital past our shack out to the gate to be buried. And I watched, because you could hear him, the cart rattling, and always looked. He would, more and more frequently, he would carry a body, starvation or disease aided by starvation past. Now they were becoming more frequently, and sometimes there were 2 bodies on the cart as they went by. We were getting desperate, and food was getting shorter. the folks' reserve ration was running out. And then it was the 2nd of February, 1944. The, excuse me, that evening we could see fires in the distance, so a group of us boys climbed to the top back of the main building, not far from where our classrooms were, and we looked out at the fires in the distance. And we could see a fire, and then suddenly there'd be a fireball up in the air. And I asked a man standing there what it was, and he said, well, it's a fire of gasoline barrels, and they're being explosions, they're throwing them up into the air, and then they're exploding once they get up into the air. This was after roll call and before curfew. And then it was the 3rd of February. We had been prisoners for exactly 31 months. It was my job to go and get the family rations. And I was getting the late after, it was only twice a meal, the late afternoon, or the afternoon ration. Each of us got one small ladle of lugol. That was our half-day ration for each of us. And just as I got to the back of the main building where the kitchens were, I looked up and there was an SBD-6 Marine fighter bomber going so low with the canopy open I could see the pilot's face, and I saw him throw something out of the cockpit. Well, I got our rations, and by the time I got back, everybody in camp knew that the message wrapped around his goggles was, roll out the barrel, your Christmas will be today or tomorrow. We went to roll call that evening. Everything was normal. After roll call, after curfew, we're sitting in the shack doing our normal multiplication tables, something I still remember. And I heard a crash by the front gate. Well, I knew a girl from Davao that had a house on the other side of our little shanty town, so I ducked out of the back of our shack. Whoops. This is the back of our shack. That's my sister and the little boy next door. He looks fairly chubby. His parents, I think, gave him half of their 3-person ration because they were skin and bones. But I stepped out here onto the path, and suddenly a Japanese guard that I hadn't seen up at the front of our house on the road barked and turned around and pointed his gun at me. And I can remember crouching down there, looking up past the bayonet, up the barrel, and a month went by. And apparently, finally, he decided I was not a threat, even though I was violating curfew. And he turned and started off. In one leap, I was into our shack, landing hard on my right shoulder. The only time I was ever really concerned, and the whole time we were interned. But to his memory, my thanks for not shooting. He would be dead within a month. A little while later, we heard what sounded like Japanese trucks, because the Japanese had no tires and no gasoline. So they were running their tires on the rims, and it had a very peculiar sound, but it sounded just like that. And then there were big explosions at the front gate. That's where our shack was. This photo was taken by Army Recon as an exercise some 6 months after we were gone, and they had bulldozed those shacks, the only thing you could do with them. They were, by that time getting very urban, invested and falling apart. But we were, as I say, literally cat-a-cornered across and just right on the road. But we were out here on the road. The Japanese guards were on the first floor and part of the second, and we looked up. I was squatting, Dad was standing, and suddenly this strange soldier in the strangest uniform and the strangest helmet, carrying a little short gun and a little box that I now know was a walkie-talkie, and the biggest boots I ever saw, came running up the road this way. And he asked my dad, are there any Japs around? Dad pointed him over here where the barracks were. I can remember he said something about perimeter, and he kept running. to go out here to where the fence was on that perimeter. MacArthur had done it. He had sent the 37th Division on foot and the flying column of the 1st Cavalry with the 44th, with a platoon of the 44th Tank Battalion under the command of Lieutenant Robert E. Lee, Jr., a descendant. They came 100 miles around in a looping manner to get to Manila, which was at that point 62 kilometers behind enemy lines. It was a raid, if anything, more daring than the one that's in the movie about Cabanatuan, and ironically, they left from Cabanatuan on the great raid to rescue us. As we watched, Lee's tanks came up, and one of them pulled up and stuck its gun into the front door of the education building, and at that point my parents moved us back into the shack, and the Japanese guards took over the whole building, making hostages of the prisoners who were on the upper levels, and shooting started between the RGIs along here and the guards in the building. A lieutenant in a Jeep parked in front of our house, our shack, and he was hit in the hand, and my parents decided it was time we should be in the air raid shelter. So we went down in the air raid shelter, and there Mom dug out, she ran back up and dug out of our hidden place the last food we had. We had a 12-ounce can of Argentinian corned beef. If you remember the sloping cans and the key to open them. I got to open the can, and I got to take the top and to lick out every last bit of fat that there was in it. We took one spoon and we just passed it from on, taking little tiny bites. But we ate that whole can in one sitting instead of the 3 days that Mom would have spread over it for to keep us going for another week. And when things quieted down, we were full, we were comfortable. We went back up and climbed up into our bunks and went to sleep right there on the front lines with the Japanese there and our troops out there in front. They took the front window off our shack to set up a machine gun right there in front of us that they used to keep an eye on it. At this point, if I can have the next slide. This picture was taken by Life magazine, but those are prisoners in the those are prisoners at the windows with the Japanese guards behind them. And it was a very sticky situation. We didn't realize how precarious it was because the 700-man unit had a lot of things to do once they hit Manila, and only 100 of them were there initially at our camp to corral the 60-some Japanese guards and defend the perimeter of the camp for the 3,700 of us who were almost 3,800 who were starving former prisoners. And the Japanese at that point had 16,000 first-line troops in the city of Manila. So we were a long way from the rest of the cavalry. On the third day, a truce was finally arranged, and in the strangest incident of the war, Japanese marched out of camp with their flag, with their guns. On either side of them was a row of GIs with their guns. Probably the only time in World War II when Japanese and American combatants marched side by side. The Americans escorted them out about a mile and turned them loose, and they came back. It was clear that they wanted to be escorted further. We were told by one of the first cav that came back that the guerrillas were waiting for them, but I think that was a story, and I've never found that confirmed. But MacArthur had been determined to save us because at that point 98 prisoners had been massacred on Guam. It had just happened that 157 military prisoners had been massacred on Palawan Island in the southwestern Philippines, and later all but 6 of 2,000 Australian prisoners would be massacred in Borneo. The Japanese had issued order in June of 1944 that in the event liberation threatened, that all the prisoners were to be killed as if they had never been there. A few days later, a bunch of us kids had gone to the main building because there were 3 Japanese prisoners there. And the GI there said that they had found the orders for our execution scheduled for the 4th of February. I can't find that anywhere, but that's what he told us, and I believed at the time. That was the morning after our rescue. Somebody in a Bilibid, which was 3 blocks away, writes and published that their execution was scheduled for the 5th of February. So whether or not the orders were there to do it, whether they execute or plan to, is another story. But now that the Japanese were gone, we were on the receiving end of the Japanese artillery, just 2,300 yards away, as they fought to this Battle of Manila. The High Command had said Manila would be an open city, just like MacArthur had done in 41. The Marine Admiral Iwabuchi said, "No way, Jose, we're going to make them pay for every yard." He had 13,000 Marines and 3,000 Japanese soldiers, and it cost the lives of 1,010 American soldiers to take the city, not counting the wounded casualties. Some of those soldiers were killed while in our camp. It also cost the lives of 17 of us freed prisoners, one of whom I knew, that had been killed by Japanese shell fire. We had some 60 prisoners, former prisoners, were injured by shell fire, and we also lost 80 who had either too far gone from starvation or had died from overeating. If your stomach is shrunken, it atrophies, and you can kill yourself by eating. Mom made sure that we got 3 tablespoons and then waited several hours before we got 3 more tablespoons of very bland food until our stomachs could not only expand but regain their flexibility so that we could actually eat. But we were down to skin and bones. That's the family there about 2 weeks later, so we'd had 2 weeks of good food by this point. And the next slide is my dad coming back from with the family rations. He had recovered from his beriberi, a B12 deficiency, and was still not well. One night when the Japanese artillery was particularly heavy, we slept on cots behind the education building, the one you saw there. And I can remember looking up and watching the tracers and the shells go overhead before we drifted off. But one night Dad was too sick to leave the shack, and a line of shells came in and ended with a dud not far from the shack. The next one in that line would have hit the shack. The next morning, fortunately the dud was the last one, and next morning we kids went and got all around, huddled around the dud standing there in the pathway. But we had made it through. But in the Battle of Manila, 100,000 Filipinos were killed, many of them massacred or worse by the Japanese. The 1,010 American soldiers, 17 of us, all casualties of that battle. Mid-March, we flew over Japanese anti-aircraft fire. I asked the pilots what those little black puffs were down that we were seeing below our plane, and they said, well, they can't hit us. Shortly after we were liberated, a soldier, while we were out there playing around the tanks, which kids will do, asked me to put on a cartridge belt and get up on the tank, and with my sister and another boy, and said, it'll be in the papers at home. And I can remember saying, sure. But indeed, this picture appeared in the February 16th Akron Beacon Journal. They couldn't find my brother, so they picked a third boy to come along. But it was the first word that anybody in the States here had that any of us had survived, and it was the first word in 18 months that any of us had survived. The middle of March, 17th of March, we went through Manila, now the next slide, which was one of the two most destroyed cities of World War II, Warsaw being the other one. It was true devastation. Yeah. We flew over the anti-aircraft fire to Leyte near Tacloban, where at a rehabilitation camp, the soldiers and sailors did their best to spoil us kids. They threw a party for us and fed us cake, which we hadn't had in 3 years. And then they gave us that cold, hard, yucky white stuff, which we picked at, and then, you know, nobody eats anything like that. They couldn't imagine how vanilla ice cream would not be popular, but none of us kids ate any of it. And I'm still not that fond of it. From Leyte, after a short time, we went on the SS Klipfontein, a ship carrying recuperating soldiers. We went to Biak, which at that time was the largest hospital complex in Southeast Asia, picking up more, and then on to Hollandia, Finchhaven, and then across by ourselves, zigzagging, to San Francisco. And it was one of those glorious days under the Golden Gate Bridge with the fireboats and the horns on the bridge as the ship came in. Goodyear had found us unobtainable compartments, first-class compartments on the train to come back to Akron. And once in Akron, we went to the first-class Mayflower Hotel, where we stayed for about 6 weeks. Our parents had pulled us through, healthy mentally and physically, and at the cost of years and years of their lives. I can't say enough for them, but I think MacArthur perhaps says it best. Even though they were civilians, they were awarded the Asiatic Pacific Combat Ribbon with 1 battle star for the Battle of Manila, and have in their orders, by command of General MacArthur, have by their fortitude and courage contributed materially to the success of the Philippine campaign. I thank you. We got about 5 minutes, I guess, for questions. So, yes, sir.
I guess first of all, my wife's father was one of the invaders of the Leyte Gulf.
Oh, okay.
He may have been one of your neighbors, because I think he was involved in the prison camps campaign. But anyhow, what ages were you?
I was 8. I had just turned 8 when we were captured, and I was going on 11 when we were rescued. So, on the other hand, you don't normally have memories, but these memories are so vivid that, you know, at whatever age you retain them. Yes, sir.
Where are your siblings?
Both in the Louisiana. The one is in Baton Rouge and the other outside of New Orleans. Parents were sent there after the war. We went back to the Philippines, and then when they came back, Dad said enough of the plantations, so they gave him a job running the office in New Orleans, and my siblings ended up settling in that area. But, yes, sir.
Yeah, it sounds very intensive. Where did you get the money for building that shack at the end? How did they get it?
Goodyear had something like 26 people, and in Manila there was access to the outside. So there was access to money. In fact, Manila, Santa Tomas sent us money down to Davao when we were totally broke and the Japanese weren't feeding us, weren't giving us any money for food. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
How long did your mom and dad live?
Dad died at 70. He has a sibling who just celebrated her 97th birthday, and most of his brothers lived into the late 80s. My mother died at 67. Yes, sir.
How did your father obtain permission, I guess, if you will, to build that shack? Where were the rest of the people?
The rest of the people were on the dance floor.
How did he
No, the one thing about all of the camps, Americans are organizers and democratic. In every camp, we elected, and every year re-elected or elected new people to run and to distribute the work to make sure everybody did. And by going to the council and getting permission, he was one of the first, so, you know, there were perhaps 8 or 10 decided they wanted to do that, but in order to do that, you had to be able to go make something of it. It's like a homestead. You have to farm it for 5 years, but in this case, we had to build something on it. Ladies and gentlemen, I appreciate the opportunity to tell my parents' story. I wish you well on your next one.
A very small token
Oh,
from
thank you, thank you.
the Medina Library.
I'll trade you.
Thank you so very,
It's
very,
a pleasure.
very much. We just keep hearing something new about this war, don't we? Yeah, this was a,
Let me close
Thank
with one
you.
item. The band Death March and the prison camps and what have you died defending the Philippines. But for each of us, military and civilian prisoners, who were rescued, 3 Allied warriors died in taking the Philippines. Many more Filipinos died in the war, and 36 Japanese soldiers died defending the Philippines, trying to hold off the invasion of Japan. For each one of the lucky ones of us that was rescued, more than 50 died. And that's the sad part of war. Thank you.
There were 2 more cities that were completely annihilated. Hiroshima and Nagasaki. None of us should ever feel sorry for any of those Japanese people.
Well, my estimate is that the use of the bomb probably saved the lives of something like 40 million Japanese. You know, I've studied that fairly extensively, and now I can't hate the Japanese. They were raised from the time they were 3 and 4, and if you raise somebody from that, you can raise them to believe anything, as we're finding out in the Middle East. You know, that being a suicide bomber is a heavenly thing to do. If you start young enough, you can get there. And that's not the fault of those people, it's the fault of the system that got it in that situation. So I will.